In Magic the Gathering, some of the most expensive cards are some of the oldest. These cards can cost tens of thousands of dollars. They are protected by something called the reserve list. The reserve list is a promise between company and customer to ensure the maintained value of the investment of the customer's collectible. Many Magic the Gathering players know that it is one of the most important aspects to the longevity of Magic the Gathering. What many players don't know, however, is that the reserve list is a lie. Before we get into why the reserve list is a lie, and believe me, it absolutely is, let's start by setting the scene. I know some of you watching this video may not be familiar with the reserve list, so let's break it down. Few now play who remember it. It began with the forging of the great sets. 3 were Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited, immortal and fairest of all sets. 7th was Legends, filled with great heroes of the Pendril Vale. And 9th was Fallen Empires, which above all else had nothing of power. For within these sets were bound the cards to collect and play, but they were all of them deceived. For a reprint product was made. In the land of Washington, in the fires of Renton, wizards forged in secret a reprint set to make the game accessible to everyone? Into 4th edition and Chronicles, wizards poured hope and joy to the players struggling to get reprints. Wait, this is kind of going to a wholesome place. What's the problem here? One by one, the free players of Magic the Gathering complained. Yup, they complained, and just like is often the case, Wizards of the Coast listened. By reprinting so many cards that players had been painstakingly collecting, the reception was cold, to say the least. Thinking on their feet, Wizards then made the decision to end the controversy and sate people's need for stability. The reserve list was born. The reserve list is a list of 572 cards from earlier sets that will never be reprinted by Wizards of the Coast. The list, in its original form, was conceived as a way to help collectors feel good about the rare cards they'd collected. Back in 1995, a reprint of many cards from older sets in the 4th edition expansion was cause for controversy. An additional reprint set, Chronicles, solidified those complaints. Today, the reserve list has many old format favorites on it. And that's the reason you'll likely be familiar with it. Dual Lands, Moxen, and other Legacy, Vintage, and Commander staples just so happen to be on this list. But of course, the reserve list doesn't need to exist. These cards don't need to be in short supply, and honestly, it's one of the biggest things holding the game back today. Though there are many cards on the reserve list that are begging for reprints, whether that be Gaia's Cradle for Commander or Mishra's Workshop for Vintage, the dual lands are the biggest sticking point. There is no reason why they can't reprint them, and there's no reason to think the secondary market would be affected much at all if they did. Let's get right to it. If Wizards of the Coast reprinted Dual Lands or the Moxen, the price of the original printings would never tank. These cards would never be $1 each, or however else you want to spin it with hyperbole. If they were to print them in a newer product, people who owned original Dual Lands wouldn't lose money. They're still collector's pieces at the end of the day, and they always will be. And we can prove this with original printings of non-reserve list cards. Let's start with something widely considered unplayable that has had a bunch of reprints. Good old Shivan Dragon. This card today is given away for free. You heard me, it's free Shivan Dragons. It comes in the red sample deck that Wizards of the Coast until recently gave to local game stores to give to new players free of charge. So Shivan Dragon is a free card. It's a free card. Despite that, the unlimited printing fetches about $165. The beta printing fetches up to $1,700, and the alpha version fetches up to $5,000. But Professor, if they reprinted reserve list cards, they'd tank in value, I hear you say. Well, frankly, that's a load of bullplop. Not satisfied? Well, let's look at a playable card. Birds of Paradise from Mystery Booster is $7, but the unlimited version is $175. From beta, you're all the way up to $1,200. And if you would like an alpha Birds of Paradise, it'll cost you about $3,000. This is a card that has seen printing after printing after printing. Need I go on? Well, I think I will go on. How about some more non-reserved list cards from later sets? Let's take a look at Scroll Rack. Scroll Rack was printed back in Tempest and has seen very few reprints. It is not on the reserve list. Its first reprint was in a short-run product, Commander's Arsenal, and the second reprint was in Kaladesh as a hard-to-find masterpiece. Today, the Tempest version is upwards of $70, with the Arsenal reprint over $100, and the masterpiece pushing $200. Even with a non-reserved list card that wasn't an alpha, the price has held, and the short run of limited availability reprints haven't kept the card down in price. If anything, the price has gone up. I want to emphasize something here. In the hypothetical world where the reserve list is gone, just because Wizards of the Coast could then reprint dual lands doesn't mean they actually would. They're highly unlikely to just put them in this hypothetical situation in $4 booster packs, and even if they did reprint them, they would no doubt manage and curate the list of older cards in the same way they currently do for other in-demand reprints. They demonstrate this with fetch lands and cards like Jace the Mind Sculptor. What do you think they'd do with Mox Emerald? Well, it sure wouldn't be in Battle Bond 2. It'd be in a Masters set at Mythic. Or they'd invent Ultra Mythic, and it would be printed once in a blue moon. The argument that collectors will lose value is not only false, but in fact, the opposite would happen. Reprints of dual lands would, as a net result, add value to players' collections. Going and paying into a premium booster draft and being able to walk away with legacy and commander staples like dual lands would be an incredible thing. Many in the MTG finance world support the removal of reprint restrictions in regards to the reserved list as well. They overwhelmingly want people to be playing Vintage and Legacy. Even Mark Rosewater is a staunch champion for getting rid of the reserved list. He's said in the past that he wants to design sets that use these cards. In fact, most people at Wizards within the R&D side of things are aligned with Morrow. Come on, when Mark Rosewater is saying get rid of the reserve list, get rid of the reserve list. What's more, the existence of updated versions of reserved list cards will make the original versions all the more coveted. The original art and original frame will be the bling. Many of the legions of new legacy players that would be born from these reprints would gravitate toward wanting to acquire the older cards, and demand for those older cards would only increase as a result. You just have to look at how people construct their mana bases. Sure, the battle for Zendikar full art lands might have annoyed some people that had invested in the original Zendikar full arts, but if you look at the price difference today, there's a stark contrast which only increases when you look at foils, and they're only basic lands. So everyone agrees that the reserve list should be done away with, but unfortunately, it can't be done away with due to legal reasons. Except no. Yeah, I'm calling shenanigans on that one, too. The idea that people would sue Wizards of the Coast is a load of bullplop. Bullplop. Why? Well, that comes down to the fact that the case would be based on something called Promissory Estoppel. This is a legal term for when someone breaks a promise they've made to the detriment of others. You would ultimately have an incredibly hard time proving that a change to the reserve list has caused you detriment, particularly because the reserve list has already been changed. Yup, the reserve list over the years has had things added. It's had cards removed and changed many, many times. Strangely, there hasn't been a lawsuit in reaction to any of these changes. Wild, right? It's almost like you'd struggle to make a case. And the strength of any case based on Promissory Estoppel today would be made all the harder because no case was made when these many, many original changes to the reserve list happened. And, well, in essence, the legal issues surrounding changing or abolishing the reserve list are a lie. Originally, the reserve list was home to cards like Sol Ring, Demonic Tutor, Regrowth, and Basalt Monolith. Those cards have since been removed from the list and now see regular reprints, and the prices of the original printings are still really high. These changes took place in 2002. The next time the reserve list would see any major attention was in 2010. Before 2010, Wizards hadn't ruled out reserve list cards coming back as premium versions. That version of the reserve list allowed for this to happen. However, after Duel Decks, Phyrexia vs. the Coalition, and From the Vault Relics released, there was again backlash. People were grumbling once more that Wizards was reprinting valuable cards, and even using the loophole of printing them as premium exclusive cards, players saw Wizards as going back on a promise. Now, whether you agree or disagree with whether this was a fair complaint, and I'm quite firmly in the camp of disagree, seeing as there never was a hard and fast promise, it matters little, because thanks to that new uproar, the reserve list was again adjusted from that point on. Now, no tournament legal reprints would be allowed at all. The thing is, there wasn't a single lawsuit when those changes happened either. Despite printing cards like Wheel of Fortune that year as a judge promo, Wizards wasn't sued. The prices of the original printings of these cards didn't change. Alpha Wheel of Fortune, in fact, stayed pretty flat before going up in value recently. So Wizards released a new statement in 2010 to close the loophole. In doing so, they changed the reserve list yet again. Precedent at this point had been set many times over for Wizards to add to, remove from, or otherwise change the reserve list. And, by extension, precedent had also been set for no legal issues. In the history of the reserve list, no legal action has been taken through any court proceedings. And again, I want to stress that Wizards of the Coast had added cards to the reserve list and taken cards off of the reserve list. They are printing cards today that were originally on the reserve list, but they decided, let's take those off the reserve list. No lawsuits. They printed reserve list cards in From the Vault and Duel Decks. They printed it in a Duel Decks. And no lawsuits. And the thing is, the reserve list was never intended to be a set-in-stone thing. The original ethos was that the list could change. And it did, many times. We should approach the reserve list as something that can still and should still be reviewed and changed. I really think that we should start by just taking the dual lands off of it at the very least. Keep the list, take the dual lands off of it, let's see what happens. Put them in a master set. At the end of the day, it's hurting older formats and watching as Legacy uptake slows due to the lack of these key game pieces is truly tragic to see. The thing is, the demand is only going to increase. Beyond Legacy and Vintage, more and more Commander players are building more and more decks. Those decks benefit from dual lands, and at some levels of play, cards like the Moxes, Mox Diamond, we want some of those for Canadian Highlander and other popular new formats, or ones that we haven't seen yet. And reprints are going to make them available to people, and if that happens, the original versions will still hold their price. Beyond even Commander players, there's huge demand from cube enthusiasts the world over to include dual lands, Moxen, and the Power 9 in their cubes. You only have to look at how popular these older cube formats are on Magic Online to see how much interest there is in playing with Power. And hey, thanks to the pandemic, Gen Con this year was canceled. The answer to the lost Magic gatherings was to host a Magic Online Vintage Championship as part of Gen Con Online. But here's the kicker. You were able to brew with nearly every card available on Magic Online for this tournament for free. You didn't need to own them, and you didn't need to pay to rent them. You just had to pay to enter. Guess what happened? The uptake was huge, particularly in players who didn't normally play Vintage. And is it any surprise why? It is my personal belief, my strong personal belief, that if money weren't an option, you could just play whatever format you wanted because you could have whatever cards you wanted, that the majority of players would probably be interested in Legacy above formats like Modern and Pioneer. Legacy would probably explode. It would be many players' primary Eternal format. All that needs to happen to revive Legacy and really grow the player base is for Wizards to reprint, at the very least, the dual lands. I mean, heck, they've even commissioned artwork for Vintage Masters on Magic Online, so they don't even need to pay to get new artwork done. It exists. One of the most popular products on Magic the Gathering Online ever was Vintage Masters. It was drafted into the ground. And it's a reason why a mana crypt costs a little under 4 ticks online, and a plateau costs only a tenth of that. The reserve list is an antiquated relic of a bygone time. The game has moved on, and we should too. Let's make Magic the Gathering accessible for everyone. We can do so without affecting collectors' pieces and without having a legal battle. Looking to add another Commander card class to your schedule? Expand your curriculum by clicking now and listening to this lovely lecture on Sunforger.